welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this special event that we have on today. My name is Nina, and I'm Head of Pre-Sales Engineering here at Infinite Lambda. Just briefly, if it's your first time coming across Infinite Lambda, we're a global data and cloud consultancy and academy, and the organizers of today's event. I'll have the pleasure of moderating our panel today. And just a small piece of admin before we get started. We're going to take some audience questions at the end of the panel. So if you have a question that you would like answered by one of the panelists or by all of the panelists, then please post it in the questions tab that you should find on the bottom right of the screen, not the chat tab, but the questions tab. And we will review those and try and get as many of those answered for you at the end. Great, so without further ado, let's get started. So by way of brief introduction, data contracts and data as a product are both hot topics at the moment. As more and more organizations are starting to adopt these approaches and frameworks, we're also starting to see some common concerns and themes emerge. So questions like, how can people who use a data product know that they're going to be able to trust it? How do we guarantee quality, timeliness, consistency? What are data contracts? How do we facilitate collaboration between the different teams in our businesses and organizations? And so data contracts sound like they might offer a solution to many of these questions. So hence the focus of the panel discussion today. How can data contracts kind of help us in our journey to building data products? So I'm delighted to welcome three fantastic panelists today who are joining us from various locations across the globe to share their expertise, who are all thought leaders in this space. So I'd like to hand it over first to Chad and then Yali and JGP to introduce themselves before we get started. So Chad, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. I appreciate that. Well, hi folks, good to see you. My name is Chad Sanderson. I am the founder and owner of a community for data quality oriented professionals called Data Quality Camp, which you can get to by just typing dataquality.camp/Slack into your browser. Quick plug there. Prior to that, I was running the data platform team at a late stage freight technology startup called Convoy, where we did a pretty large rollout of data contracts, saw a lot of the good, a lot of the bad, and ultimately I try to share some of those mistakes and wins on LinkedIn. And then prior to that, I worked at Microsoft and have been in data for about 10 years.
It's
awesome. Thank you.
So just following on from Chad. Hi everyone, and thanks Nina for inviting us all here. My name's Yali. I'm one of the co-founders at Snowplow, a company I co-founded 11 years ago now. It's quite a long time ago. At Snowplow, we build technology that companies use to create behavioral data. So data typically describes what their customers are doing second by second and minute by minute, which is very interesting data. They can do a lot of things with. And at Snowplow, I get to spend a fair amount of time with our customers and open source users, an open source version of our tech that's used by thousands of companies around the world to understand how some of their challenges around data and how they organize around that. So very interested in the topics we're covering today, and we spend a lot of time thinking about them and how we can incorporate some of those concepts into our product to help our customers. Prior to starting Snowplow, I've spent my career in data, so a lot of time as a consultant using data to help drive operational decision making, strategic decision making, and then some time in startups using the data for kind of product and marketing and strategic analysis. So delighted to be here. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Yali. At JGP?
Yeah, so my name is Jean-Georges Perrin, or JGP, makes it easier for a lot of people. I'm a technologist and consultant. I'm a lifetime IBM champion. That's how IBM defines their thought leaders. I've led many data platform projects, and the latest is a data mesh at PayPal. I've wrote several books, including Spark in Action's second edition at Manning, and I also wrote little funny data mesh for all ages that you can get on Amazon. I also contributed to some open source project, including the data contract template that was released early May, and I lived in upstate New York. Back to uni. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So you can probably see why I'm a little bit starstruck by all three of the panelists today, but let's start with what's hopefully the basics before we get to things that are more controversial. All three of you have spoken extensively in the public realm about both the concept of data contracts and their benefits and data as a product. But maybe starting with Yali, so could you share your definition? What is a data contract? And why would we think about that as a concept? Why would we have one?
Sure. So if I may add, before defining a data contract, I think it's helpful to think about data as a product and treating data as a product, because I think that's a less controversial but quite a significant movement in data to bring product thinking into the way organizations manage data. So realizing that data isn't just an asset, it's this thing that has customers, and those customers will take the data and do different things with it, and those customers have needs. And it's helpful if the data has a product owner or product manager, and it's part of her job to, use the resources that she has to prioritize the development of that data and the data product that data is a part, to meet the needs of those different customers. And you can think of her as a data product manager and her customers as data consumers. You have this dynamic in lots of businesses. We have data that's produced by a team or an individual and different people that are consuming that. And in that context, a data contract I think of as really a specification for that data product, something clear and unambiguous that the data product manager, data consumer can use to drive shared understanding with her different customers, those different data consumers.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think there's lots that you can go in there and so on, but maybe I'll stop and let the other speakers disagree or agree and build on what I've shared.
I could see JGP nodding there. So did that resonate? Clearly, there's such a close relationship between those two concepts of the data product and the data contract.
Yeah, I think you can't build a data product without a data contract, but you can still use a data contract outside of a data product. That's. I'm not saying I'm disagreeing with you, Yali, but I would say that's the kind of the slight nuance I would bring there, because the data contract at its core is really an agreement you have between a data producer and a data consumer. Okay, so when you're looking at this at least that's my definition. So if you're looking at this very basic definition, you don't really need a product there, but it's on your way to making products. And if you don't do data products, you're not doing modern data engineering. So I would, do contracts, but jump to the next step, do products as well. So.
Great, thank you. And Chad, I kind of saw you nodding along a little bit there as well. But so these two intertwined concepts of data products and data as a contract, what is the kind of category of problems that you would say that they're intended to solve together?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest category of problems they're intended to solve is ownership, but there's lots of knock-on problems that extend from ownership. So, for example, I think it's meaningful to maybe take a step back a little bit and talk just for a second about the way that data development is a bit different from software engineering, because a lot of times we sort of assume, well, because we're doing software engineering and we're following software engineering best practices, that it means that everything's hunky-dory on the data side. But in software engineering, teams are encouraged to move very quickly, to build microservices, to operate in silos. and in data that does not work. Data products are, like, by definition, highly dependent and interconnected to data that's coming from other teams. And those other teams, the vast majority of the time, have no idea even how their data is being used downstream. And so if you are not able to solve that problem, then you will always have data that is changing in a locally optimal way for the team that's using it for a totally different purpose than analytics and machine learning. And so that means you will never have true accuracy, which, for data products is incredibly important, number one. And then number two, if things are changing all the time, if there's really no system of change management that's organized around and a managed data asset or object, then what consumers do is that they just layer on filters and case statements on top of their SQL in order to account for things changing after the fact. And that means that it means your data environment is going to grow exponentially. You're going to have exponentially more tables, tons of duplication, because every data analyst and data scientist is going to look at a query and say, wow, this is a 1,000-line SQL file. I would love to be able to use this data in my dashboard, but I have no idea what's going on under the hood. And so instead of doing that, I will go and talk to an engineer, and I'm going to ask them exactly what these logs are, and I'm just going to use it myself. Then the things upstream change because the producer has no clue of who's actually using the data, and the process begins again. So I think that a huge amount of problems, from like data discovery to the cost of managing an analytical database, all stem from this problem of not having good data ownership.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think, so Chad, you and Yali have both talked about this concept of data being produced intentionally. And that's the way that we can kind of get good data quality and get these contracts and products, versus data that gets emitted or just spat out by other pieces of the system as a byproduct. Yali, I know you wrote a little bit about this in the concept of kind of events as the atomic unit. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, of kind of that push-pull, so creating data intentionally so that it can be used in data products?
Yeah, happy to. So in data, for like a lot of the history of data, the actual data that we work with has always been a byproduct. So if you go back to kind of the first era of data warehousing and the kind of invention of ETL, the idea was you have all this data that's in these different business systems. You want to do analytics on it. So you want to get the data out. And the ETL was born to solve that problem, to get this data that was created for one purpose and to transform it and optimize it into a format that was optimized for analytical purposes, a new set of purposes. But your starting point was this data that had been created for one purpose, and that broadly worked in the 70s and 80s. But the landscape has changed enormously between then and now. And if you look at your average operational system, the data that sits behind it could be a NoSQL database rather than a well-structured relational database. It might have rapidly evolving schemas, either implicit or explicit. The rate at which things are moving are changing. And then the types of data that we're interested in using have expanded enormously, especially with the sort of growth in machine learning and AI, where we're like driving value from more and more data sets. I guess large language models are just the latest example. And suddenly, like, we can start thinking of the whole internet as a data set we can use to feed our models. So the types of data that we want to do stuff is just growing all the time, and that data is changing more and more. And that model of, well, let's just take what we've got and build quite an expensive, quite a brittle process to take it and turn it into what we need, has become less and less tenable. And so I think what organizations need to be doing now is deliberately creating data. So starting from, what's the data application, what's the need I have for data, and then thinking about what the right way is to engineer that data creation and where in our operational systems we want to do it, and do it explicitly. So it's not a byproduct. We're not change data capturing it out of a database that it happens to be stored in, but our applications are actively emitting, hey, this thing just happened. I want to capture that with this packet of data that explains exactly what happens. And then that's explicit in the code. You can write unit tests against it. You can put SLAs against it, etc.
I think what you said about that kind of state of being with lots of disparate systems, some designed intentionally, some not designed at all intentionally around producing high quality data, something that probably resonates with the audience here, and who are thinking about whether these concepts can be relevant for their organization. How can they start? And I know JGP, you have taken PayPal on a lot of that journey and ended up open sourcing the data contracts framework as a result. So I guess for folks who are looking at getting started, like where do I start as a data or technology leader? What would you look for concretely? Is there anything that needs to be in place first before you say, okay, I'm ready to start trying to introduce data as a product thinking to my organization?
I think it's coming down to your business goals, right? So when we worked on data contracts, and I think a lot of companies I'm consulting with as well, one of the issue is the trust in data. Okay, so the thing is, okay, everybody understands the value of data, but it's really about how can I trust it? Okay, and so as Yali mentioned the three-letter word, okay, SLA, and Chad is bathing into data quality. I think this is where the data contract can actually, really be helpful. Okay, so if your target, if your need, if your goal for your company is that to have not more data, but a better quality of data, better availability of data in general, then that's a data contract that can be very useful for that. Now, where do you start is really how mature you are. Okay, so what I've been working on with a few folks is also some kind of a maturity model. Okay, so and what is your roadmap to, I don't know, maybe data mesh? Okay, let's say the end goal is to build a fully blown data mesh. Okay, which is basically a mesh of data products which will relies on data contracts. Okay, so if you already have your data contracts, good, you can go to the data product. If you get data product, you can go to the data mesh. But if you've got nothing, okay, so maybe the first step is to go to the data contract. Okay, so how do you get started is really about trying to isolate some kind of easy-ish use cases, okay, and get on board like any IT project. Okay, don't try to boil the ocean. Okay, so which is pretty gross anyway.
Yeah, true. That's funny. I mean, and Chad, you've said that anyway, the vast majority of data issues are cultural rather than technical. So, like, does what JGP just said resonate? Can data contracts help us address those challenges? Or, like, is it the other way around? Do we actually need to address some of those organizational challenges before we're ready to do that?
I think that organizational challenges must actually be addressed through technology. Like a good example of this happening is Agile. If you go into any engineering organization that's doing waterfall and say, hey, you need to be Agile now, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback, right? Engineers do things based on the value that it adds to their own lives and not what some, random person tells them to do, because like theoretically it might add value. But once we saw the introduction of version control and Git and GitHub and CI/CD, all of those things resulted in incremental product delivery that could very easily fit within an Agile framework. And you started seeing teams become Agile without anyone actually telling them to, because the technology made the right thing to do the easy thing to do. And I think that's exactly what data contracts do as well. Data mesh, data governance, iterative data governance, I think that becomes possible if you have a surface where you can define the data you need. There's some very simple Git-based way for the data to evolve over time, and both stakeholders, or all three stakeholders rather, the producers and the consumers, are very aware of each other when things need to change. So I think that technology it has to drive the culture problem. I don't think there's any other way to do it. And there's one other thing that I wanted to say and sort of extend Yali's point a little bit and maybe add some more context into it, which is, and also JGP's point, which is I think it would be really good for everyone to think about the evolution of data at their company, the maturity, as JGP mentioned. And I think that what Yali is talking about is actually a bit farther down the maturity curve. When most companies start, they are generally not really thinking about data at all. They don't really take it seriously because they have a product to build. They need to find product market fit. And if they don't do that, then their whole company is going to dissipate, right? It will die, and it won't matter how great their data is. And so obviously they're not going to put a lot of effort into emitting a bunch of events or creating great data architecture. But there comes this point where all that sort of directional data and using data for, you know, making marketing decisions or product decisions, it starts to change into something else where it has to be accurate, right? When we start to use data for machine learning and AI, or we're starting to get audited by the government, to me, that's what a data product is. And so when data products actually become important to the business, well, all of a sudden now we need events and we need really great architecture, but there's no vehicle to assist in that transition. You kind of, to Yali's point, you're still stuck in this world of let's just dump things from our data lake into our analytical environment and go from there. And the data producers have no idea who their consumers are. And so a lot of data teams find it really tough to then go to those teams and say, hey, I actually need you to think in terms of events, because these microservices and these monoliths have existed for 5 to 6 years by the time they actually need the data. And so there needs to be some way of managing that transition to governance and quality iteratively over time. And that, to me, is the primary role that the data contract serves, which is, okay, sure, give me the dump of data. Yeah, I need to go in and experiment and figure out what's useful, because I may not even know from day one. But once I do that, I need to have the ability to communicate to a producer and say, hey, I've got some meaningful use case now, and here's what I actually need enforced. I need you to take ownership. This is what I need from you in order to generate trust. And ultimately, I think that needs to culminate in events. So we decouple from the databases, we implement events, and those contracts carry over regardless of the actual underlying technology that facilitates them.
Yali, does the point that Chad was making there about kind of the evolving maturity resonate? Is that what you see happening with Snowplow users, for example?
100%. So I think it's yeah, I agree with Chad, absolutely. There's a journey that organizations go on, and there's a point at which the pain of not having data contracts and not really having any control whatsoever on the data that you're creating and trying to build on becomes really, really acute. And that is the moment to implement data contracts. And it always, as with anything, it feels too late. You always wish you'd done it earlier. You wish you had the last 6 months of data, 12 months of data in a format you could trust. But the truth is, if you did that, you're probably being premature. And I do now occasionally see organizations jump to over engineering things. I think organizations should feel the pain before they make the investment, because then they know they're going to see a return on that investment.
I wonder, JGP, if you were feeling that pain at PayPal before you embarked on that journey. And I also wanted to pick up on and put to you a point that Chad made around tech or data contracts specifically enabling data mesh, because I know data mesh was also the journey that you were going on there. So was that your experience too?
So we were facing some um, specific challenges regarding our data, which I may not be able to describe too much. But in a nutshell, we wanted to increase the reliability and the trust we had in our data. Okay, so it really, and as a financial sector is a highly regulated industry in the U.S., probably not as much as in Europe, but it's still pretty regulated. We have to uh, make sure that we can provide the data and that we not only the data but also the way the data is being built. Okay, so if you do a succession of transformation in your data, you've got to prove that you're actually doing it in the right way, in the correct way. So that's a little bit the kind of challenges. Okay, so we were, of course, PayPal is pretty mature when it comes to its data, but it was going to the next step. Okay, so how can we be ready as well for the future, for more compliance? Okay, like when you in the US, when Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt, okay, you can imagine that our legislator is probably working on more constraining reporting and requirement in terms of money. Okay, every time there's a crisis, there's a new bunch of laws coming out, which is going to impact your data and the way you do reporting and the way you do all these things. And another thing is we were a pioneer. PayPal was a pioneer in self-service around data, and to increase the quality of self-service, you needed, on top, a little bit about what Chad was saying about governance. Okay, you need to be able to increase governance. It's not just about self-service. If you just have self-service without governance, you're creating a big mess. So here are the same things. The data contract can help guide the self-service part in providing a better governance. Okay, so all these things are linked. Okay, and when you look at all these things, it's kind of the four principles that data mesh is around. Okay, so that's typically something that is you can see that everything there starts to be meshed, really.
And I couldn't help but notice you mentioned semantics, or I'm not sure if you said semantic layer, but that's definitely what popped into my head when I was listening to you as well, because it feels like that's a third concept that's bandied around a lot lately, and it is also getting a lot of attention, the concept of a semantic layer that's translating or providing definition or an interface between reality and the data, right? So do you need to have a data contracts in place to have a well-functioning semantic layer then? Is that what we're saying?
I'm thinking my vision of the semantic layer is that it's embedded in the data contract. Okay. And it makes links to somewhere else where eventually you can describe it. Let's imagine a use case like that. Okay, you've got your data governance in a tool like Colibra or Infosphere, the data catalog. Okay, and this is where you're defining the data, the fields, the rules about that. But because it's your traditional Fortune 500 kind of tool for managing this thing, and then you've got your data contract that is defining your specific use case, your specific data product. Okay, but the thing is, it's linking to your enterprise data governance solution. So when you've got this link, this is where your semantic layer comes into place. This interface between the physical world and the logical world. Okay, but I'm not. I don't love, to be honest, the term of semantic layer. I think it's just something that is naturally inside. Okay, so if you want to call it semantic layer, yeah, okay, what not? Okay, there's a different things. Okay, Yali was mentioning SLAs. In a data contract you should have SLAs. In a data contract you should have a semantic layer, etc., etc. Right? The thing is, it's kind of this umbrella, this potpourri of everything you can put regarding your data. So at least
I think
my
just to build on that, JPG, I think something I think is helpful is if you're going for that self-serve model, and lots of organizations are, is putting yourselves in the shoe of a new in the shoes of a new data consumer, and thinking, what are all the things that this consumer needs to drive value from this data set? And a big part of that is understanding what the data means in as an unambiguous way as possible. And today in most organizations, you figure that out by, you have to go and talk to all the different engineers that were either involved in the creation of that data, or you go talk to other people other data consumers who've used that data, who have that knowledge in their head. And data contracts, we have the opportunity to codify that knowledge in a formal way as part of the data contract. I think it's a really great data contract if somebody new can join the organization, read the contract, and then they know based on that what to do with the data. But I think that's quite different from the concept of the semantic layer, which I think is different.
So and to add to that, yeah, like one of the issue I'm seeing, not specifically at PayPal, but in many companies, is data discovery, right? And the thing is, that's exactly what you're describing. If we can ease data discovery or reduce the cost of data discovery, this is like, I think Forbes estimated like 15% of a data scientist's time is data discovery, which is ridiculous. So if you can reduce that, and it's not by listing just all the fields, okay, it's a little bit further than that, but and data, and then I think that's where I kind of have a mixed feelings on semantic layers. Okay, why do we really need it? Okay, unless you have a restricted definition. But anyway, yeah, all good. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Do we have all three of the panel skeptical about semantic layers or them existing independently of data contracts? Let's hear from Chad as well.
I don't know. Maybe. I honestly haven't thought about it that much. I think that my opinion is that semantic layers, this may get me in trouble. Semantic layers, like a lot of other kind of data initiatives, are kind of, they're like trying to solve, it's sort of a band-aid for a gunshot wound, right? Sort of like saying, hey, we need to, construct this layer where we define all of our metrics and all of our dimensions, and they need to be very well organized and based on domains, and we need to have a single source of truth. I remember having a conversation one time with a data scientist at Convoy, and we were sort of talking about semantic layers and data catalogs and these types of things. And we had implemented a data catalog at Convoy, and not many people were using it the way that I had hoped. They were using the index quite a bit, but ultimately, like JGP was saying, like they were still having to go and talk to the engineer and figure out like how has this data evolved over time, and they weren't using a lot of the lineage functionality in a way that I wanted. And I was just asking, like, what needs to exist in order to make this easier for you? Like, do we need a semantic layer? Do we need, like, what do I need to add here? And they said, you need to make sure that the data is good. If the data was good, then you don't need all this stuff, right? If I know that the data coming from my database, that like this thing represents, Convoy was a freight company, so this is the database that represents a shipment. And each row represents this, and each column represents this. And I know it's high quality, and I know I can trust it, and I know there's someone that's treating it as an API. I don't need all these other things. I'm just going to go use that because it's very simple. So I don't know. I think that's kind of what I've seen is that a lot of the technologies that we talk about are sort of retroactively trying to solve a problem that needs to be addressed much, much earlier in the pipeline. And if you can do that, then I think this conversation around semantic layers becomes a lot less meaningful. Maybe it still exists, right? But I think it's more of a nice to have than an essential function.
Just a slightly different perspective. I think I agree with Chad that semantic layers don't solve the data quality problem, and I think they solve a different problem, but it's also different to data contracts. I think if you've got metrics, especially more complicated metrics, and you've got a large organization, it can be very hard to keep people consistent on when they're using those metrics, and that can just lead to a huge amount of friction. Like when different people produce the same report with different numbers in, it's just a waste of everybody's time. It's and metric layers and semantic layers do a good job of, you can centralize those definitions, push them out, and it's easier for different people to pull those numbers. Great, ton of value. It's just a different problem to the one data contract solve. And it definitely sounds like in the case of Convoy, the problem that you guys need to solve wasn't one that a semantic layer would have been suitable for.
Well, I think that ultimately we did have the problem of lots of different versions of the same metric being duplicated all across the organization. But I think a reason that happened was that there was actually no source of truth from the upstream, and so everyone then had to create their own interpretation of what this metric was. Everyone sort of defined their own version of margin, because there was no version of margin that was like, oh, this is the thing that's actually being maintained by someone, and it has an API, it has like an SLA around it, to your point, and it's very trustworthy. Like that didn't exist, and so each team would then go in and say, well, this is kind of how I think about it, and this, I'm going to add these like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 dimensions. I think the same thing happens in, this is sort of getting back into the Bill Inman territory, but the original purpose of a data warehouse was as an integration layer, where you wouldn't really need a semantic layer, because you would integrate all of your data. In Convoy, for example, we use Salesforce, but we were also pulling in shipments data, sort of like one of our core customer objects, from a database. And so some teams would use this database copy in order to like answer questions about how many active customers do we have right now. And then some other teams, like the teams on the marketing side, would use the Salesforce data. And there was some slightly different ways that they computed this, and there were some slightly different filters that they would add. And so depending on who you would talk to, you would have a different answer for how many active customers do we have right now. And so the sort of question is, at least the question that I have is it that we need, I don't know, like I said, I haven't thought about this that much, but do we actually need some like central interface that is like regulating all these things, or do we just need like better data warehouses? And do better data warehouses come from like good high quality data from source systems?
I'm loving all the hot takes on semantic layers, and I didn't even know we would get that today, so that's awesome. JGP, any last word on before we move on from semantic layers?
No, I think we've said enough things.
Yeah.
I think it's not our favorite topic.
yeah, I got that. Great. But yeah, so maybe going back into the specifics for the audience as well, who's thinking about like, how do I tackle this thing? Yali, I was interested when you said, a new person in an organization comes in and reads a data contract. So data contract clearly it's a concept rather than a technology, but do we have any best practices, or is there anything that you'd recommend as far as like, how do you actually document and create these things, or will that just entirely vary depending on the organization in terms of tech staffing, I suppose?
That's a great question. I think I'm super interested in JGP's and Chad's answer to this question. I think we as a industry are coalescing around the key elements that a data contract needs to contain. So data contract needs to encapsulate the semantics of the data. Data contract needs to encapsulate the schema. Data contract needs to encapsulate the SLA, the guarantees on the data, potentially the policy, like what you are and aren't allowed to do with the data, and the sort of compliance that has become such a big topic. We don't live in the world we 10 years ago. We could just pick up any data and do what you want with it, especially if it's customer data. So I think there's a reasonable amount of consensus around that. I think there's also consensus that data contracts evolve, and so they need to be version controlled. You need to be able to see how they've evolved over time. And if you are treating data as a product, it's the two of them evolving in tandem. But how you implement that technically, I think is probably wide open, but I don't think matters too much. I don't think data contracts, I might be shooting myself in the foot, or I might be getting this wrong. I'm sort of working out as I'm saying it. I don't think from a technology perspective, they're hugely complex. I think there's a bunch of interesting things you can do off the back of them from a technology perspective. Can you infer from a contract a set of automated tests? Can you use these as building blocks to help the data product management workflow? But I think we're aligned as an industry conceptually, less so technically, but I don't think the technical stuff is too complex. But I shut up and let someone smarter than me correct me and build on that.
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. I think that so to me, the contract from an implementation perspective, it only has two components. One is the spec, and the other is the mechanism of enforcement. Those are the two pieces. I think if you have just the spec without the enforcement, you've got documentation. If you've got just the enforcement without the specs, then you've got tests. And it is the combining of the two together into a single system, to me, that is what creates a contract. And as long as you're doing that, whatever way that you're doing it, I think it's fine. I mean, I certainly have recommendations in terms of what is the easiest implementation. I feel that YAML is incredibly flexible, and to Yali's point, because there's so many things that you could layer on top of or beneath contracts, then maximizing that flexibility is a really good thing. But it isn't, 100% necessary to go that route. And same with enforcement. I think that there's different types of enforcement that a business could prioritize at different times. At Convoy, we started with schema enforcement. So schema registry, doing backwards incompatibility checks, things like that. But there's other companies I talked to where schema changes were less valuable than having an SLA. And having the SLA requires a different type of enforcement. And so, and there's some companies I've talked to where their number one priority was PII and compliance. Like, they needed to be sure that the data defined in a contract was not used by a consumer in an inappropriate way. So I think I think the technical implementation depends on what the needs of the business are, but as long as those two components exist, it's basically fine.
So I think the implementation of the data contract, I've seen a lot. So when we open source the data contract at PayPal, we picked, well, and before that, because it was based on our implementation, it was YAML. Okay, so we picked YAML for that, and the reason for YAML was because it's human readable and it's machine readable. Okay, so I even had the question, why didn't you use XML or something? Yeah, because it's 2023, right? But the thing is, the idea was to make it both human-ish readable and uh, and machine readable, because then you can do, as Chad was saying, you can do a lot of different testing, a lot of different enforcement. Okay, so one of our constraints we wanted to make sure was actually this schema change. Okay, so is there's an upstream schema change, how do I get warned, and not like 5 days from now, but like right away. Okay, so you would be able to check against the contract as the schema didn't change, or if it changed, even no, you could eventually thinking about the uh, going back to semantic, but semantic versioning. Okay, so whether it's going to be a patch, a minor change, or a breaking change. Okay, so all that we included in the way we were dealing with the data and how the contract was evolving. So all that is all that is kind of linked to. I've seen that Zoltan asked a question about I think about the PayPal data contract, and if it would be something usable for mid-market. Yeah, it is. I know several companies, mid-market companies, that decided to follow the PayPal template. And you don't have to implement everything. Okay, so it can be, the thing is, as much as you put in your contract, so you're getting more and more precise in what you're sharing. Okay, so like when Yali was saying, the thing is, if you're working on data discovery, the more information you put, the more tutorial you put in your data contract or the link, the richer it is for your consumers. But it doesn't have to be that field. Okay, and it could be also part of your maturity, saying, hey, I want data quality for half of my field, for example, in before it goes to production. Okay, so you can have CI/CD, you can have DevOps methodology directly on your data contracts. Okay, so it's all kind of linked. Okay, so you can start with this template, you can adapt it. That's why it was open sourced.
Cool, thanks. It clearly takes some investment though, right, to start shifting over to a data as a product mindset and start implementing data contracts. So let's say you've started to do that in your organization. How do you know if that initiative is starting to work? What signs do you look out for to know that you're being successful or that it's not working out?
I'd say you start being successful when you see people stop rebelling against the change.
Okay, nice. Chad?
Well, so the sort of primary metric that we used in our implementation of data contracts, we actually used two metrics. The first one was number of outages prevented, and this was actually a relatively straightforward thing for us to figure out, because like I mentioned, and like JGP said, we started with schema changes. And so if we were able to detect or stop a backwards incompatible schema change for happening, and we also knew who are the downstream consumers of that contract and how meaningful are those use cases. Like, is this a machine learning model that makes $100 million a year leveraging this contract? Is it a dashboard the CEO looks at? We could also quantify the impact of stopping that outage. And so when that number started reducing, right, when we stopped saying effectively, like, hey, we're not stopping as many outages anymore because people are communicating better. That was a really awesome thing to see. And to that point, the my sort of subjective metric, unfortunately, I didn't use this in my actual planning document because nobody would have liked it, but it was my favorite, was the number of conversations that were happening between consumers and producers. Previously, there was nothing, right? A data producer would act solely in the interest of their application, and the data consumer would act solely in the interest of whatever data asset they were working on at that time. But what we started seeing with contracts is that there was a huge amount of awareness. The amount of awareness of both teams increased significantly. So data producers would actually start going to consumers unsolicited to say, hey, we've been thinking about rolling out a new feature. We know that you have a dependency on our data. How is this going to impact you? And consumers would start proactively going to producers and saying, hey, we just discovered a new interesting use case for your data. We would like to extend our contract in these ways, and here's all the business value that's going to have. That was really amazing. Not only was it amazing just because you're building a more collaborative organization, but also because the data engineering and data infrastructure team, which was my team, started to be insulated quite significantly from a lot of those conversations. So before, if anything breaks, the consumer sees it first. It all gets dumped onto our backlog, and then we essentially need to figure out what is important and what's not. And that just basically stopped happening. I would say that the vast majority of data quality issues went away because there was now a path towards resolution. It wasn't just, hey, something failed, go to the data engineering team and they will resolve it. It's, hey, something failed. We know what it was. Let's go add it to the contract and communicate it to the producer. There was a workflow there that didn't exist before.
Yali, conversations between data producers and consumers as a subjective metric of success of data contracts. How about that?
I love it because actually as an organization, so organizations struggle to quantify the return on investment in data. And one of the most effective measures, I think, is how many data applications you've got, how many different use cases are built on the data by different teams. And then that's a very crude metric. You want some way to understand what value each of those things has. It's possible there's some one. I think Chad, you gave the example of a machine learning model that was driving loads of revenue versus a dashboard for the CEO that may have been very important, may not have been. I don't know, but data contracts can be a huge driver to data democratization, and that self-serve culture that JGP talked about, and that lots of organizations are going through. So I think to bring it back to your previous question, Nina, I think the data contracts can add value in so many different areas. I think if an organization is implementing them, they should be clear why they're implementing them and pick the appropriate metric that aligns with solving that problem, but be live to all the other benefits. And if one of those benefits is you start seeing many more teams come out with ideas about how they can use existing data sets in new ways, I think that's wonderful. And I'd identify that and trumpet that as a success across the business.
Amazing. Thank you. All right, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. I just want to put one last question to you before I then look at the audience questions. So more of a speculative one, but maybe we can go around the room, starting with JGP. Where do you think, or maybe hope, things will evolve over the next few years? So that could be technological. It could be in terms of the things that companies are achieving with the data contracts or data as a product, or interpreted in any way that you like.
I hope that the data contract, that what we're just doing now is a thing of the past, and that everybody learns about data contract like in colleges, and that we don't have to educate that much, and that it comes to light with people. I hope that some industry body or industry standardization or something takes a data contract, and whether it's a PayPal one or any other one, and put it more as a standard, so that people like Yali building tools or Chad learning and teaching about data quality could actually leverage a similar data contract, and that we could grow a number of tools, whether open source or commercial, around data contracts, and that would that would foster innovation, that would foster a more global data quality, and really release the value you find in data.
Fantastic. Okay, Chad, hopes or predictions?
I definitely agree with JGP's hopes. What I would really like to see is that data starts being treated similar to software in terms of the development lifecycle, meaning that from day one, software engineers are using system tools like GitHub and Git and things like that. And as the company becomes more mature, they're able to layer on stricter and stricter policies and governance whenever they deploy code, right? Maybe when you've got a startup that's only 2 or 3 engineers, the only rule is like, hey, someone has to approve any significant PR. But once you hit scale, you now have a vehicle where that changes, and you can sort of manage that. So as the business grows, you can iteratively improve the governance. And today in data, that's not true. We sort of just do things. We say, hey, we've got some use cases, and then once we hit scale, now we need to go and do a refactor because our data is not suitable for AI or ML or whatever it is. So I would love for contracts to serve that same type of function as like a Git or a GitHub, where you can roll out, you can improve the contract incrementally over time. Maybe in the beginning, it's very light, it's very loose, it doesn't really stop all that much. But as that sort of pipeline becomes incredibly useful and valuable, it does get more strict. You do have more governance, and there's very clear ownership and alerting and all those other things. That would be amazing. In terms of predictions, I predict, and this might be self-serving. Obviously, I'm biased because I definitely think data contracts are a big deal. But I think I don't see how this AI revolution is going to happen unless you have some type of API for data. People have been saying for years now that the way forward for AI and ML is going to be in ensuring the data is high quality and correct and available. And in order to make that happen, you need to have the ownership. You need to have an expectation of what the data is, and there has to be some way of performing change management. So I think that in order for this AI revolution stuff to happen, a prerequisite is the data contract. That's my opinion.
And just building on both JGP and Chad's answers that I loved, I think we will sort of prediction as well as a hope. I think we will move to a standardized approach of expressing data contracts. I think data contracts will evolve, so they will be these tools of governance, but I think they have value even in a world where there isn't necessarily that enforcement piece. So earlier on in organizations' journey, when they don't necessarily have those data quality issues, it's still valuable to, and I think you're alluding to this, Chad, it's still valuable to be able to specify your data in a succinct and clear way that means other people can pick up. It just means maybe the SLAs aren't there, maybe the enforcement isn't there because you don't need them at that stage. And I think vendors like myself and lots of other vendors in the industry, I think we're very interested in taking those contracts and saying, well, given this contract, how much of the upstream data engineering can we automate? So that ultimately, as a data person in a company, as a data product manager, I'm spending all my time thinking about what data do people need, and what are the data contracts, and then all the other crap that bluntly we've been, like in data engineering, we've been obsessing over for years and years. Like the tech just takes care of that. So we're much more focused on what is the data that people need and what is the difference they want to make on it, and not how do we build a pipeline that takes this and turns it into this and use the latest framework to to do X, Y, Z, and so I see a growing role of data contracts and that helping elevating the thinking of everyone in data to be much more value centric and much less engineering centric.
Brilliant. Well, there you have it. 3 experts' opinions on the future of data contracts and data as a product. It's been such an insightful discussion, so thank you so much for joining. I noticed that Chad has answered some of the questions already in the chat, which is brilliant. So I suggest, now that we're on the hour, what we'll do is send out those answers to everybody afterwards, so that we cover those questions offline. Thank you so much to all 3 panelists and to everyone joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and do follow us for more panel events coming up over the summer. Have a great day. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.